All right, so good evening, everyone. Glad to have you joining in tonight. And sorry about last week. I just had some technical problems that I just could not fix. That happens occasionally, and sorry about that. Wasn't anything I could do about it, so hopefully you understand. And glad that you are here tonight. We can jump back into Second Timothy. We probably got another 3 or 4 weeks in Second Timothy to try to get through the end of the book. Try not to go too fast, trying to just to pick out things that I think are really important to talk about, but also going pretty much verse by verse. Tonight we're going to cover Second Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. It's really a description about the last days and what the last days will be like, and just looking at some pretty interesting things, I think, that are found in that. So if you got a Bible, grab that and turn to Second Timothy chapter 3, and we will start there. If not, I also will have it on the screen for you to see. I am monitoring the Facebook feeds and the YouTube feeds. If you have comments, you want to send those, or if you want to just send me a text, that's actually the best way to do it. If you kind of watch here most of the time, just send me a text or an email if you have my email address. That's probably the best way to get a message through. But I will go back and check the Facebook feed and the comments there before I get off. It's hard for me in the way that this is set up right now. I don't really have a good way to monitor the Facebook feed just to see the comments. So anyway, that's just for what it's worth, and sorry that it's that way, but maybe we'll work on improvements in that and try to find ways to make this a little more interactive. I would love to find a way to make this more interactive, have a guest on, and I actually have the technology now that I think I can do that. So that's something we'll work on in the future. But grab your Bible, turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3, and we're going to start reading in verse 1, and we're just going to try to cover the first 9 verses. So I've got it up here on the screen. If you don't have your Bible, hopefully you can see that. I'll try to make it a little bit larger. I think maybe... Now I can get it all on one page right there. So that's as large as I can make it. And hang on just a second. There's some shadows going on with the screen. I was going to try to get rid of those with some lighting. So we'll jump into that, and we'll, chapter 3, verse 1. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. And let's just read all the way through verse 9. We'll come back and talk about it. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, have nothing to do with them. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over weak-willed women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kind of evil desires, always learning but never able to acknowledge the truth. But just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these men oppose the truth, men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected, but they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. So that doesn't paint a very good picture. I mean, that paints a really dim, dark type of picture. So Paul's not really describing something like the good old days. He doesn't sugarcoat it anyway. He just says flat out, these will be terrible times. And it's not just like it's a rough patch. I mean, this is really perilous, dangerous time. The only other time that this word is actually used in the New Testament is of the 2 demon-possessed men that Jesus encountered in the region of Gadarenes. And so it's really interesting, like, that's the only other usage. So it's like really terrible, awful kind of thing. So it's I don't know how to describe it any better than the way that Paul just described it. There are going to be terrible times, and he's not talking when he writes this. He's not talking about some far off future. The last days started the moment Jesus rose from the grave, and that God sent the Spirit to live in us, and that means, we're in it right now, and I think that's important to recognize because if you look at the broken world that we live in, that broken world that we see isn't an interruption of God's plan. It's the battlefield that God is warning us about. You can kind of feel it, I think, if you're really looking. It's maybe the weight of a world that doesn't seem to make sense anymore. You start reading the headlines, you start seeing the division that's in the world. There's, the world is full of apathy in one way. It's full of anger in another way. It's almost in a lot of ways that right and wrong seem flipped. Nobody can really agree on what truth is. And Paul is saying to Timothy, look, those days are coming. And I think it's fair to say that we're in the middle of those days. Now, if you hear that and you say, oh, Greg is saying that Jesus is coming, it's just around the corner in the last days. Well, we've been in the last days since Jesus ascended to heaven, I think, and we'll continue to be in the last days until Jesus comes again. But the interesting thing here, I think, is God's not really having Paul write this in a way that he's giving us a warning to make us anxious. He's giving the warning so that we'll be alert. It's not as if God is up in heaven wringing his hands and saying, oh, these people have just gotten so bad. He's not doing that, and we shouldn't do that. Culture crumbles, and when culture crumbles, sin gets loud, and it's going to crumble probably multiple times before Jesus returns. But as believers, we don't run and hide. What God is trying to tell us through Paul in his letter to Timothy here is that we stand firm, we hold fast, we stay awake. The world, it's not going to drift toward righteousness. The world is going to drift toward rebellion. That's the current. That's the way that the tide is flowing. That reminds me of when we would kayak, right? You get out and you kayak and you get caught in the current. And if you're trying to paddle upstream, or even if you're trying to paddle across the current, sometimes it gets pretty difficult. And just imagine yourself, that's where you are. You're in a kayak and you're trying to paddle against the current or across the current. And the current and the tide is that the world is going toward unrighteousness instead of righteousness. It's heading toward rebellion. And we row against that current. We are supposed to be the light in the dark age. We're anchored in the world when the whole world is trembling and can't figure out the way and doesn't know what's next, because we are believers in Jesus and because God has given us his word and his revelation. While everything else is trembling, we're not shocked. And we're not going to be shocked when morality collapses, and we don't panic when people mock and make fun of truth. We don't throw up our hands and say, what's the use? That's not the time to give up. It's the time that we get ready to speak for God in a world that really doesn't want to hear about God. So, I think the first thing I want to say about these terrible times is we're not victims of a dying age. We are vessels of a living Christ. And God said there are dark times coming, and when the dark times come, that you remain firm and you remain fast. And in the middle of the dark times, the light of the gospel still shines, and Jesus is still King, and God is still God, and the Spirit is still indwelling believers in Jesus, and neither the Father, the Son, or the Spirit are going anywhere. They are intervening in a dark world, and we are one of the ways that they intervene. So as he goes through this, the first thing he says, hey, there's dark times coming, and they're going to be terrible. And he starts describing what all of these people are going to be. And if you go by the text, I mean, we'll just kind of go through these one at a time. And I don't want to take tons of time going through this and telling and just saying, well, this is how terrible people are. I don't want to do that tonight, but I do want to acknowledge what Paul is writing and just ask ourselves a couple of biblical questions that you probably need to think through, and I need to think through as we go through that. You know, the first thing it says is people will be, and it's right here, I'll highlight this. I'm reading from the NIV 1984, by the way, on the screen if you want to see that. It says they will be lovers of themselves. Lovers of themselves. And so self becomes sacred. You know, we elevate, or let's say they. I mean, it's hard not to say we, because even as believers in Jesus, we have to fight against these same things. You know, and so in the last days, people elevate personal freedom above everything else. I mean, truth, morality, relationships. The thing that is more important than any of that is they become lovers of themselves. We see it in our world. I mean, people who are obsessed with personal branding, or they will sacrifice relationships, either family or romantically or within the church, because of something that they want. I mean, even, you know, if you're going to be critical of things, I'm trying not to be too critical tonight as we go through these, but even when you look at the hyper individualism and self-worship in a way that we're even, you know, we try to, even with worship to God, we try to form that in a way that we get what we want, or it's centered on us instead of being centered on God. Now, there's a way that you can love yourself in a healthy biblical way. So God is not saying here you just despise yourself. What Paul is warning against here is the difference. Maybe the way to say it is the difference between self-care and self-idolatry. You know, when culture makes self into something that seems sacred or untouchable, then I think that's what Paul is talking about here. That kind of message that the only thing that really matters is personal happiness. We're just concerned about ourselves, and there are things we can do that even when we think we're fighting against that, or we're not that, if we're not careful, there are really good things that very subtly can become self-serving. You know, it could be a career, it could be family, it could be your reputation. And when I read that terminology, they are lovers of themselves, I guess one of the questions that it makes me think about, and one of the things it makes me evaluate as I look out in the world, is I think sacrificial relationships are becoming pretty rare. I mean, the kind of relationship where you put someone else first and you look for their good instead of your own good, which is what God calls us to do in Jesus. In churches, having sacrificial relationships, sometimes that becomes rare when we're looking out for the good of another person instead of our own good. So, you know, the opposite of this lover of self is God calls us to deny ourselves. And when I say that, I don't mean that God means that you don't have any self-worth at all. That's not what God is talking about. But in practical terms of home and church and communities, we don't center on ourselves. We center on the needs of other people. And sometimes that means we deny ourselves. And our world sees that as weakness, and it sees that as oppression. But when he is describing these people and the terrible last times, he says people are going to become lovers of self, and I think it's really evident in our world. You know, the next thing he says is they're going to be lovers of money. And man, you don't have to look very far in our world to see that our world is really becoming lovers of money. I mean, we don't really hide greed anymore. It's greed is almost celebrated. I mean, success, it's measured in possessions, and it's not measured in character. And I think that's a real, I think it's a real problem, because even in churches, when we start teaching prosperity gospel, that, faith is a way that you get money, or having money is a sign of faith, or being successful is a sign of faith, or you look at social media, and social media is just flaunting these lifestyles of excess, and you got to have this and you got to have that, and you've got to be an influencer and do this kind of stuff. And it takes you back to that idea that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, right? Now, it's not wrong to have money, but it's wrong to love money. And that's loving money is different than earning money and using money wisely and being shrewd with the money that God has given us. I mean, there's a healthy way that we can have money. But here, when Paul describes it, this is the unhealthy way. This is where wealth and possessions are more important than character and integrity. It's where money is treated like a god, and where we allow the world to shape the way that we view wealth and success. And I think that's a real problem, because when we let the world shape the way that we determine what is successful, and the world shapes what wealth looks like, then that has an impact on God's instruction to us that we have contentment. And contentment doesn't necessarily mean you're not trying to better yourself, or there's not, you're not trying to make some kind of advantage at work, or you're not trying to get some kind of promotion, but it means that we can be content with the things that we have. So when we believe that material possessions become the measure of God's favor, then that twists the truth of Scripture. And so when you start hearing it's if you had more money, that would take away your problems, and that's probably not true. And looking at this from a church perspective, I mean, I think even as a church, we have to figure out, how do you respond to financial exploitation, and how do you offer people real hope? Jesus says you can't serve both God and money. Here, these false teachers in the godless days, they are lovers of money. And, I think probably, without going into some big treatise on money, which I don't want to do that, generosity becomes an act of worship, and it's not an obligation. One of the ways I think you resist the love of money and you grow in generosity and you grow in trust is the principle that God has given us about giving. God, He doesn't have to have our money. Every penny in the world belongs to Him. But He knows that in generosity and giving to others and hospitality and even giving to the church, it helps us keep our perspective centered, so that we look at the things that are really important. So they are lovers of money. Then he starts just putting things maybe in categories. It's just, I'm going to try to do that just to make this go a little faster. I know we're not going to try to go through all of these one by one. It would take forever to do that. But boastful and proud, and you look at our world, maybe arrogance used to be frowned on. Now maybe it's probably not too far to say that arrogance becomes the norm. And somebody who's humble, we tend to look at that as weakness, where that's not weakness at all. I mean, that's actually strength. So, our culture seems to reward pride, and humility is seen as a weakness, and boasting. I mean, especially you get into that digital world, right? Everybody talking about what they have and what they have and what they do and how much they make. And it becomes very subtle and very disguised. But, and people trying to impress other people. So you fall into that trap of constant comparison. And when you fall into that trap of constant comparison, I think it robs us of joy and purpose. And, even boastful and proud in the way that, I'm just trying to point out ways that you see this in our world. People don't really like correction anymore, and they resist any kind of accountability. We we take constructive feedback and we label that as a personal attack. And if you do that, I mean, how do you stay open to growth? How do you stay open to understanding there are things that you can do better? And so pride affects all of those relationships and humility. And so Jesus comes along and he says, blessed are the meek. And then he uses words like abusive and disobedient to their parents. I probably talk about that in larger terms. It seems, I'm just looking our world and looking at this list, right? It seems like any kind of respect for authority almost seems like it's in a free fall in our world, that boundaries don't really mean anything, and honor is not really respected as being honor. You see viral videos of people who are abusing other people, and this disrespect of society, disrespect of other people. And I know sometimes we put that in comedy or media, and I think I love good comedy as much as anybody, but you have to be careful that even good comedy has boundaries and it has some respect in it. And disobedient to the parents. You think about parents and authority figures as parents, and I think it's fair to say that's declining in our world, where we're supposed to honor our parents according to God. And we just kind of have this general idea of disrespect, and especially to authority. So without going on a tangent, when the basic boundaries of society start to degrade with respect and honor, then the society itself starts to break down. It's and you look at that, and I think the challenge is reclaiming a spiritual kind of leadership without resorting to control or to fear. You try to lovingly encourage other people and help show where those boundaries are. Again, I don't want to go through these one. He uses words like ungrateful and holy. That's not hard to see. Gratitude fades. Entitlement increases. Even the word holiness, we think that sounds like that's an outdated word. That was something for another time. And people become ungrateful over the smallest things, right? We have outrage anytime that we're inconvenienced. We lose any kind of reverence for worship or daily life, or again, for the authorities that are in daily life. We have these casual attitudes towards sin. We're ungrateful, and we're unholy. And in an unholy world, it's hard to remember to be holy. And I don't know why. I started to say, I don't know why holiness feels so outdated, but I think deep down I really do. I think holiness feels outdated in our world because we have such a casual attitude towards sin. We just don't take it seriously. And we don't take it seriously because we don't respect authority, which means then we don't respect God. So if we don't respect God and his authority, and then we don't respect his direction, then we have a casual attitude towards sin because we become the center of everything, and we become ungrateful and unholy because of that. And you see it in every aspect of life. You see it every time you get out and somebody reacts to something so quickly. He says they're without love, they're unforgiving, they're slanderous. Now, the problem I have reading through a bunch of these is simply this. Sometimes I feel like I'm kind of these. So I'm trying to be honest in saying that, sometimes I really struggle with being all of the things that are on this list. So I don't want to come across like I'm saying, hey man, look how bad everybody else is, because I think we all struggle with these in different ways and in different areas. Without love, unforgiving, and slanderous. Just think about our world. Look how easily we break relationships, or look how quickly people cut each other off over disagreements, whether it's work. And That's especially true a lot of times in churches, and that's the last place it should be true, but sometimes that's the place it's true more than any other place. There's no patience in the world. There's no grace in the world. We have, we got cancel culture, and we have rage in comment sections about stuff, and we take even gossip and say, well, we're just concerned about something. And all of these tie together. Okay, all of these tie together. So they're without self-control. They're brutal. They're not lovers of good. I mean, that's some pretty serious words there that he's using. It's in our world, when you think without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, especially that idea of self-control, in the world, pleasure drives almost everything. Goodness sounds boring and evil sounds exciting, and we let pleasure become the thing that drives us and the thing that causes us to make the decisions that we make. And I mean, you see it in our society. You see it in addictions. There's probably there's good reason that porn sites make so much money, and there's a good reason why people spend so much money on lottery tickets, and why there's a drug problem in almost every corner of our society, and why so many other things have gone wrong. It's we have this addiction to stimulation. We have this addiction to entertainment. We have this addiction to pleasure, and it creates this spiritual battleground where words like temperance and self-control, they just fade into the background. You just think about that terminology. They're not lovers of the good. I mean, what if people were just, what if they were just lovers of the good? Now, we got to go back and respect authority so we can figure out what the good is, but what if we were just lovers of good? And he goes on, he says they're treacherous and rash and conceited. Loyalty and wisdom are pretty rare. Quick tempers, and you think big egos, type A personalities, they tend to dominate. You get a betrayal of people because of clout or gain. You get impulsive decisions without any kind of prayer or counsel or desire. We have, it's almost as if in a way we have pride in our rebellion. And so he just keeps explaining they're lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and you have nothing to do with that. And he says you just stay as far away from that as possible. When you become a lover of pleasure rather than the lover of God, that means that pleasure gets the throne, pleasure's the main dish, and God just get the leftovers. It's when and this is going to sound really bad, and I don't mean for it to sound this way, or maybe I do, I don't know, but you look at how empty some churches are on Sunday and how full a stadium is, whether it's some kind of sporting event. It's faith becomes about what I get out of it, and holiness is seen as restrictive, not beautiful. Those are some of the things that I wrote down. And so, he starts going through each one of those, again, being lovers of self, having false religion. And as he kind of winds into this, false religion becomes all of these things that he's mentioning are not just bad things in a vacuum somewhere. All of these are part of the false religion that Timothy is going to have to battle in Paul's absence. So remember, these are the last words of Paul. He's given these to Timothy, and he knows that he's going to leave this earth, and Timothy is going to be left behind, and Timothy's going to be fighting this battle that Paul has been fighting, and it's this battle against this false religion that's occurring in Ephesus. That's where they have this form of godliness, but they deny its power. So he's not talking here about people. I mean, we read that list and we think, well, Paul's just talking about people who reject God. Paul isn't talking about people who reject God. He's talking about people who say that they do follow God and even wear the name Christian. They're out there, but they're not really on the battlefield. They can speak. Can you say this? They speak fluent Christian. You can speak fluent Christian and never surrender your heart. And that's the kind of people he's talking about. These are people in the church he's describing. And they know the songs and they show up in the right places and they say the right things. But deep down, there's something missing. There's no power. There's no repentance. There's no obedience. There's no awe. It looks like godliness, but it's hollow. It sounds like faith, but it's empty. It impresses crowds, but it grieves the spirit. So when I read this, it's not that I look at this and say, well, look at all of those people outside the church. No, the chilling part of this is these are people in the church, and it's not about them. It's about us. So persecution, when it arises, when these terrible times come, the persecution, he's not looking at that saying, okay, that's always going to come from the outside. He's talking about persecution that comes from the inside. It's not like it wears a warning label. It doesn't march around announcing that it's hypocrisy. It blends in, and it mimics, and it thrives where it's at, and in a way it even looks successful, and it looks like what everybody ought to be doing, but it's ignoring the Spirit, and it's replacing the Spirit with performance. And now all of a sudden you've got this church where the struggle is not just outside, but the struggle is also inside. And he goes on with this. He says, so these are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over weak-willed women who are loaded down with sins and swayed by all kind of evil desires, always learning but never able to acknowledge the truth. Now, let's back up on this a second, all right? First, let's say this. What the false teachers are doing is they're preying on vulnerable people. They're preying on gullible people. It's like Paul is pulling back the curtain, and he says, look, this is what is happening, and it's pretty chilling. They're not the kind of people who storm the gates. They're the kind of people who kind of slither through the cracks. They worm their way in, not force. It's flattery. They're smooth talking. They come in like they're sounding nice until, in our culture, in our terminology, we say they get their hooks into you. They don't go after somebody who's strong. They don't go after somebody who will give them some resistance. They target the weak and the worn down and the wounded, or people who are weighed down by guilt or stuck in shame, who, they want the truth, but they're swayed by all kind of these half-truths that are kind of wrapped in a charm. And so that's what's happening. Now, when we talk about the women, don't read this and say, Paul said that every woman was loaded down with sins and swayed by evil desires, and they're never able to acknowledge the truth. That is not what Paul said. He said you're worming your way into homes of women who are like that. Doesn't mean all women are like that, but in their society, there were some women who were like that, who were, in a way, weak-willed. And that's not to say that there weren't weak-willed men as well, but it's in Ephesus. I think you probably have a very interesting problem. Many women in that culture are homebound, and they're not really educated as much as the men are. They're in some ways socially isolated, and those women, some of them were widows. If you go back to 1 Timothy, and he talks about the widows and the younger widows and the older widows, and how the church is supposed to handle those, and what they're supposed to do with those, and how they're supposed to take care of those. So if you're socially isolated and you're spiritually unsettled, and so these teachers slide in there, they they find their way into those homes where they can take advantage of those. Without going too far into it, just try to draw something culturally. Just think of somebody, male or female, it doesn't matter, who's, maybe they're not really spiritually mature, or they're easily manipulated, or they lack some kind of discernment. And that's the kind of weakness. It's not about gender, I don't think, as much. It's about how they're processing the things in the world. So you think about somebody in our culture who, have you known anybody who sends, check after check after check after check to some religious leader who they need their check more than the religious leader needs a check, but they're using those and they're manipulating the situation so that they can get money from people who are weak, or maybe people who are looking for something else, or somebody who's looking for something better, and they're using all of their skill and all of their charm. They're using words that sounds like God's words, and they're doing that in a way to defraud people, take advantage of people. That's what Paul is talking about here. These are the people who come in and find a way that they can find somebody who's marginalized in society, and they go in, and those false teachers take advantage of them. They go in and they prey on them. They prey on the wounded and the burdened. And here he illustrates it through women, but the principle is a lot broader than just it being about women. It's this loaded down with sins, is this idea of spiritual guilt or shame, and the false teachers would come in and exploit that for control, or give false promises, or so in Ephesus, it seems like the most visible victims of these tactics were women, and that's why Paul uses them there, and this is why he talks about that in that way. But he says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these men who oppose the truth. And if you were looking in your Bible and you were studying for tonight and you were reading this and you said, well, I'm going to go out and find who Jannes and Jambres were, and you started searching through your Bible, you would not have found them, because they're not in the Bible anywhere else except here. So a very honest question is, who are they? Well, they're not found in the Old Testament. They are mentioned in some Jewish and early Christian sources, and they're the names who are attached to the Egyptian magicians who opposed Moses. So when they appear, like in a couple of the Targums and the Babylonian Talmud, there's also a lost pseudepigraphal book that some fragments were recovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Jannes and Jambres. Maybe Paul knew about that book. Maybe Timothy knew about that book. There's some apocryphal patristic literature, Origen, some, and they reference these Jewish sources that refer to Jannes and Jambres. So I'm assuming that that's who they are. I'm assuming that all of that is correct. I got a little chart here. I don't know if you can see it. So the Targum, didn't mean to do that. The Targum, Pseudo-Jonathan, the Babylonian Talmud, the book of Jannes and Jambres, the church fathers, they all refer to these names as Pharaoh's magicians, that back in Exodus where Pharaoh had magicians. So they're the historical opponents of Moses. They're symbolic of archetypes. They're symbolic of people who resist the truth. They are symbolic and examples of counterfeit power, and they're cautionary examples because they're exposed as fools. Remember, they could do some things, but then they couldn't do others. They mimic a miracle, but then it gets to a point that they can't do the miracle that Moses is doing. So they become symbols of all the people who resist the truth. So that's why Paul uses them here. He says, look, like those two guys who become this symbol of people who have counterfeit power, who are historical opponents of God, who are example of people who look like they know what they're doing, but they're exposed as fools. That's what these men are. They look good, And what they're saying sounds good, but what they're doing is not good. You know, and that's the godlessness that we're going to face in the last days. They're, you know, he ends it, he says, they're men of depraved minds who, as far as the truth is concerned, are rejected, but they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. So it'll be made known. And where Paul is going to go after this, when you get into 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10, he says, okay, but look, you know about me. Paul's going to draw this comparison between what he has done and who he is and what he wants Timothy to accomplish, as opposed to these false teachers, these guys in chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, where he says, look, there's terrible times coming because these things are going to surface in the church. And they surface in the church, they surface outside the church, and if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit those very things surface now. I mean, there are situations where we're trying to make sure that we keep truth grounded in truth, and I think that's why, that's why church leadership is so important, and that's why elders are going to be judged more strictly, because that is our job. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We are supposed to be guarding the flock from that. So anyway, hope you enjoyed all of that. Next week we will jump into another section. We'll go to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 10 through 17. Sunday morning we'll be live streaming at 9 o'clock. It is the last instructional part of the class about how to read the Bible, and then we're going to get into some other stuff after that. So please join for that. And then after that, we will be Memorial Day, and we're going to be looking at Jesus said, do this in my memory. So we'll be taking a look at communion and how it fits, and maybe looking at it in a few different ways, ways maybe we haven't looked at it in a while. So looking forward to that. So hope you enjoyed the live stream tonight, and let me make sure there are not any questions that I need to look at. There's not usually, y'all usually not much about sending a question. So again, we're going to work on a way to make this a little more interactive. But I hope you have a great evening. I hope you enjoy your evening, and I will talk to you again next week on Wednesday night. And please join us on Sunday morning for the live stream.